The cold seeped through the floorboards of the saloon, a bitter truth that matched the rot in Caleb Blackwood's soul. He stared at his cards, the painted kings and queens, a meaningless mockery of power. Across the table, railroad foreman Jedediah Thorne grinned, his teeth yellowed by tobacco and cheap whiskey. The pot was a paltry collection of coins and promissory notes, but the stakes had just been raised with a cruel jest. Thorne, flush with liquor and arrogance, had thrown in the indenture papers for a Chinese widow and her 2 children, acquired from a desperate railroad contractor for a pittance. He called her his China doll, a piece of property to be wagered like a sack of grain. The other men laughed, a harsh, grating sound that scraped at Caleb's frayed nerves. He should have folded. He should have walked out into the biting wind and returned to the echoing silence of his ranch, a place where ghosts whispered in every empty room. But the whiskey had numbed the part of him that cared, leaving only a reckless, hollow ache. He saw the bet. He won. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned silence, then a few grudging congratulations. Thorne shoved the papers across the table. "She's all yours, Blackwood. Enjoy the joke. That's all she was." A punchline to a story he never wanted to be a part of. He found her waiting by the general store, a small, still figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. 2 children, a boy and a girl with identical dark, solemn eyes, clung to the folds of her simple blue tunic. They were shadows, barely there. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground as if she could find an entire world in its barren patterns. Caleb felt a surge of resentment, hot and sharp. This was not his doing. He was not a cruel man, not by nature, but grief had carved him into something hard and unfeeling. He had lost his wife, Lily, and their daughter, Sarah, to the fever 2 winters past, and the world had lost its color, its warmth, its meaning. Now he had 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more souls to haunt his empty homestead. He gestured curtly towards his wagon. "Get in." He did not offer a hand. He did not speak another word. The journey back was a study in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels, the weary sigh of the horses, the ceaseless wind that swept across the plains, these were the only sounds. He could feel her presence behind him, a quiet weight, a silent accusation. He refused to look at her, keeping his eyes on the horizon, a flat, endless line that promised nothing but more of the same. He was a man living in a tomb of his own making, and he had just invited in 3 more ghosts. When they finally arrived, the sun was a bloody smear in the western sky, and his house stood like a grey headstone against the encroaching dark. It was a place where hope had come to die. The house was a shrine to sorrow, every surface coated in a fine layer of dust and neglect. A half-finished meal from days ago sat on the table, a testament to his apathy. The hearth was a black mouth, cold and empty. Caleb grunted, pointing to a small, windowless room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. "There," he said, the single word a command and a dismissal. He expected tears, protests, perhaps a plea. He received nothing. The woman, simply bowed her head in a gesture of acceptance that was more unnerving than any outcry. She led her children, and Bao, into the small, dark space and closed the door without a sound. Caleb stood in the middle of his cold kitchen, the silence now heavier, more profound than before. He felt a flicker of something ugly, disappointment. He had wanted a reaction, a confirmation of his own misery mirrored in her. Instead, her quiet dignity was a silent rebuke. The next morning, he awoke to a strange and unfamiliar scent. Smoke. Not the acrid smell of a house fire, but the warm, earthy fragrance of burning hickory. He walked into the kitchen to find a fire crackling in the hearth, its light dancing on walls that were no longer grey with dust. They were clean. The floor had been swept, the table scrubbed. A pot simmered over the flames, releasing a gentle cloud of steam that smelled of rice and something savory, something alive. Mai moved with an economy of motion, a silent efficiency that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. She had brought order to his chaos, warmth to his cold. She had invaded his grief, not with noise or demands, but with the simple, persistent act of living. He watched her, his arms crossed over his chest, a fortress against the strange, unwelcome feeling that was beginning to stir in the frozen depths of his heart. It felt dangerously like a thaw. Her children were as quiet as she was, their small faces impassive masks. They moved like mice, scurrying along the edges of rooms, their large, dark eyes following Caleb's every move. He ignored them, just as he tried to ignore their mother. They were part of the transaction, the living embodiment of the cruel joke played upon him. But children are not ghosts, they are relentlessly present. One afternoon, Caleb sat on the porch, whittling a piece of scrap pine. It was an old habit, something his hands did when his mind was too full. He was carving a bird, its wings half spread, just as he had done for Sarah countless times. He didn't realize he was being watched until a small shadow fell over his work. It was the boy, Bao. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the sliver of wood taking shape in Caleb's hands. Caleb's hands froze. A wave of pain, sharp and visceral, washed over him. This was Sarah's bird. This was his sacred ritual of memory, and this strange child was trespassing on holy ground. He was about to snarl, to send the boy running, but Bao did something unexpected. He pointed a small finger at the carving and whispered a single, clear word in Chinese. Then he looked up at Caleb, his expression not of want, but of simple, unadorned recognition. A moment later, his sister, Anne, appeared at his side. She held out a treasure of her own, a single, perfect wildflower, its purple petals a stark splash of color against her pale palm. She offered it to him. Caleb stared from the flower to the two small faces, and the ice around his heart cracked. They were not asking for anything. They were offering. They were sharing their world with him, a world that still contained small wonders like wooden birds and purple flowers. He could not bring himself to take the offering, but for the first time in 2 years, he didn't turn away. He simply sat there, the unfinished bird in his hand, a silent witness to an innocence he thought had vanished from the earth forever. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that promised violence. A blizzard, sudden and ferocious, descended upon the plains, burying the world in a sea of white. For days, they were trapped, the house groaning under the weight of the snow and the force of the wind. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the roaring gale a constant reminder of their isolation and fragility. It was in this crucible of cold and confinement that the boy, Bao, fell sick. It started with a cough, a small, dry sound that quickly deepened. Then the fever came, raging through his small body like a wildfire. He tossed and turned on his small pallet, his skin burning to the touch, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Caleb's carefully constructed apathy. He saw not Bao, but Sarah, her body racked with the same fever, her blue eyes glazed with delirium. He saw his wife, Lily, her face a mask of helpless terror. The past was no longer a ghost, it was a living, breathing nightmare, replaying itself in his own home. He wanted to flee, to ride out into the storm and let it swallow him whole. But Mai's quiet strength held him captive. She did not weep or panic. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She bathed her son's forehead with snowmelt, murmuring to him in her soft, lyrical tongue, her voice a fragile shield against the storm within and without. Caleb found himself moving, acting. He chopped more wood, his axe striking the logs with a desperate fury. He kept the fire roaring, a bastion against the encroaching cold. He melted snow, brought her water, held the boy's trembling body when she needed to rest. They worked together in a silent, desperate dance, two souls bound by a shared terror. In the dead of night, with the wind clawing at the cabin and the boy's fever at its peak, the silence between them finally broke. Mai sat by the fire, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "My husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her English halting and pieced together. "He build railroad. Big mountain fall. He is under." She stared into the fire, her eyes seeing not the flames, but the memory of rock and dust. "They give me nothing. Just papers. Say I owe them for passage. For food. For his grave, the stark, brutal simplicity of her story struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He had seen his own loss as a singular, monumental tragedy. He never considered that the world was filled with such sorrows, that this quiet woman carried a grief as heavy as his own. A dam inside him broke, and the words he had kept locked away for 2 years spilled out raw and painful. "Fever," he said, his voice raspy. "It took them both. My wife, Lily, and our daughter, Sarah." She was only 6 inch. He spoke their names, and the sound of them in the small, warm room was both a comfort and a wound. He felt Mai's gaze on him, and for the first time, he met her eyes directly. They were filled not with pity, but with a profound, shared understanding. She nodded slowly, a deep sorrow passing over her features. "I am sorry for your Lily," she whispered. Then, as if offering a piece of herself in return for his confession, she added, "My name is Mai Lian." She paused, searching for the word. "Lian is a flower. A lotus. It grows from the mud." Caleb froze. The name echoed in the storm-lashed silence of the cabin, hitting him with the force of a revelation. Mai Lian. Lillian. It was a phantom echo, a cruel rhyme spun by fate. The cruel joke from the saloon twisted into something else entirely, a strange, painful, and undeniable connection. He wasn't just sheltering a stranger, he was living with the ghost of a name, a shadow of the love he had lost. The blizzard raged on, but inside the small cabin, the storm in Caleb's soul had finally, terrifyingly, broken. The world thawed. The snow receded, leaving the earth muddy and raw, hungry for the sun. Bow's fever broke, his recovery as quiet and gradual as the turning of the season. A fragile peace settled over the small ranch, a quiet rhythm of shared chores and unspoken understanding. Caleb found himself watching Mai Lian, not as a burden or a ghost, but as a woman. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough, gentle and strong. He listened to the soft melody of her voice as she sang to her children, a sound that filled the empty spaces in his house. The sharp edges of his grief began to soften, worn smooth by her steady presence. He started leaving small carvings for the children on the porch rail in the mornings, a horse, a cat, another bird with its wings fully spread, ready for flight. He never saw them take the gifts, but they were always gone by midday. One afternoon, as he was mending a fence line, he saw them coming. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright spring sky. He knew them instantly. Jedediah Thorne and 2 of his cronies. A cold knot tightened in Caleb's stomach. They rode into his yard, their horses kicking up dust, their laughter loud and unwelcome. "Blackwood," Thorne called out, his voice thick with condescension. "We got to talking. That poker game was just a bit of fun. We've come to take back the joke." His eyes raked over the cabin, landing on Mai Lian, who had appeared in the doorway, her children half hidden behind her skirts. A leering grin spread across Thorne's face. "Or maybe you can pay us for her keep. A man gets lonely out here." The old Caleb, the numb, broken man from the saloon, would have acquiesced. He would have handed her over, paid them off, and retreated back into his frozen silence. But that man was gone, melted away by a quiet woman's grace and the warmth of a fire in a cold hearth. He looked at Mai Lian, standing on the porch of the house she had made a home. He looked at An and Bao, their dark eyes wide with fear, and he felt a surge of something fierce and protective, a feeling he thought had died with his family. He walked slowly, deliberately, from the fence line to the porch, placing himself between them and the leering men. He didn't reach for the shotgun propped against the doorframe. His stillness was more menacing than any weapon. "She's not a joke," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that surprised even himself. "And she's not for sale," Thorne scoffed. "Don't be a fool, Blackwood. She's just property." A piece of paper. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. It was as hard and unyielding as the granite hills behind his ranch. "This is her home," he said, the words a declaration, a line drawn in the dirt. "And this is my family." The word hung in the air, solid and irrefutable. "Family." Thorne stared at him, searching for the broken man he thought he knew. He found a stranger, a man who had found something to defend, something to live for. There was a tense, silent standoff. The wind whispered through the new spring grass. Finally, Thorn spat on the ground, his bravado crumbling in the face of Caleb's conviction. "Have it your way," he snarled, pulling on his horse's reins. "But don't come crying to us when you get tired of your China doll." They wheeled their horses around and rode away, their threat swallowed by the vastness of the plains. Caleb stood his ground until they were nothing but small specks on the horizon. He had not won a fight with fists or guns, but with 5 simple words. He turned and looked at Mylian. Her face was unreadable, but in the depths of her dark eyes, he saw a flicker of something new. It was not gratitude. It was hope. Spring deepened into summer, and the land came alive. The garden Mylian had planted behind the house flourished, its neat rows of green a testament to her patient care. The scent of wild roses mingled with the smell of fresh-baked bread, and the house, once a monument to death, was now filled with the quiet sounds of life. Laughter, soft and infrequent at first, began to echo in the small rooms, mostly from the children, but sometimes a rare, low chuckle from Caleb himself. He taught Bao how to hold a whittling knife, their hands covering one another as they carved a small, clumsy horse. He watched as and helped her mother, her small face a study in concentration as she learned to stitch a seam. He was no longer just an observer in his own life, he was a participant. The silence between him and Mylian transformed from a chasm of distance into a comfortable space of shared understanding. They spoke more, not with words, but with actions. A cup of coffee left on the porch rail for him at dawn. A perfectly mended shirt laid on his bed. A bucket of fresh, cool water brought to her from the well without her having to ask. These small gestures were the bricks and mortar of their new life, building a foundation of trust and affection. They were 2 broken people, scarred by their pasts, who were slowly, carefully, learning to heal each other. They were finding that a family was not something you were born into, but something you could build, piece by piece, from the wreckage of what came before. One evening, as the sun bled gold and crimson across the sky, Caleb sat on the porch steps, polishing a small, simple ring. He had hammered it himself from a silver dollar, smoothing its edges until it shone softly in the fading light. It was not a grand jewel, but it was solid, whole, and made by his own hands. Mylian came out and sat on the step beside him, a respectable distance between them. They watched the sky in comfortable silence for a long time. The crickets began their nightly chorus, and the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky. Finally, Caleb turned to her. He didn't have the words for poetry or grand declarations. His language was one of simple, honest truths. He held out the ring. It lay gleaming on his calloused palm. "For you," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "If you'll have it. A promise. That this is your home." Always. Mylian looked from the ring to his face. His eyes, once so cold and distant, were now filled with a steady, quiet warmth. She saw in them not a master, not a savior, but a partner. A man who had faced his ghosts and chosen to live. Slowly, she extended her hand. He took it, his rough fingers gentle as he slipped the silver band onto her finger. It was the first time they had touched out of choice rather than necessity. Her skin was warm against his. It felt like coming home. They didn't speak another word. They didn't need to. They sat together on the porch, their hands now clasped, watching the last light fade from the sky. They were a man, a woman, and 2 children, a family forged in the crucible of sorrow and silence, now facing the future together under a canopy of stars. The cruel joke had ended, and in its place, a quiet, resilient love had taken root and begun to grow.